One curious feature of democracy is that it enables voters to choose less democracy. A case in point came earlier this month when Turkish voters gave additional powers to the president and less power to their own future trips to the ballot box. And that's not the only election where the appeal of doctrinaire, charismatic leaders has been surprisingly strong. Is there a rising tide of authoritarianism in the world? And if so, why is it happening now? Joining us now to consider that, in St. Louis, Missouri, Sarah Kendzior, regular contributor to the Globe and Mail and author of the ebook, The View from Flyover Country. In Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Jonathan Weiler, senior lecturer in global studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and co-author of Authoritarianism and Polarization in American Politics. And here in studio, Lucan Way, professor of political science at the University of Toronto, and Mariam Mufti, professor of political science at the University of Waterloo. And we are delighted to welcome you two here in our studio. Mariam, for the first time on our program, thank you so much. And to Sarah and Jonathan in Points Beyond, again, a couple of first-timers, I think, with us. Delighted to have you on board for today's discussion as well. Jonathan, I want to start with you because apropos of the book you co-authored in 2009, Authoritarianism and Polarization in American Politics, what did you see happening at that time? And we're going back 7-8 years now. What did you see happening then that clearly lots of other people did not see happening?
Well, what we saw, my co-author Mark Hetherington and I, really going back 15 years or so, was what just looked like a fundamentally different disposition in the Democratic Party from the Republican Party. In other words, that there were personality types that seemed to have very different ideas about order and wariness about change, and then increasingly they were sorting themselves out into the Democratic and Republican parties in ways that were making our polarization about much more than policy disagreements and something much more visceral and gut level.
We are going to be using terms like authoritarianism and populism on this program, and they don't mean the same thing, and we need to, I guess, establish off the top what we mean when we talk about those things. So talk to us about the authoritarian personality and what you understand that to mean.
Yeah, so the authoritarian personality, which is something that scholars have been looking at for decades, generally refers to a disposition or a mindset or a worldview in which individuals have a very strong need for order. They are particularly wary of social change. They are ambivalent at best, if not downright hostile to people who sort of look and act and sound differently than they do. And under certain circumstances, they're going to find very appealing political leaders who promise them that the nature of change and the growing diversity and difference and uncertainty that they are seeing all around them in society, that those leaders are going to be able to bring that to a halt. And
Jonathan, let me do one more with you just to sort of set up the discussion here, and that is, again, to measure levels of authoritarianism, you actually asked 4 basic questions in your book about, of all things, parenting. Let's put this graphic up just to show people what we're talking about here. You asked participants, tell me which one you think is more important for a child to have. 1, independence or respect for elders. 2, obedience or self-reliance. 3, to be considerate or to be well-behaved. 4, to have curiosity or good manners. Again, help us understand this. Why these parenting questions?
Yeah, so the way that psychologists and political scientists and sociologists have been measuring authoritarianism has evolved a lot over the last 50 or 60 years. In the last 25 years or so, that set of parenting items that you just read has become popular, in part because it allows us to identify people's very basic understandings of the relationship between superordinate and subordinate people, between parents and children, between those on top and on bottom, if you will. And what we find very interestingly is that those 4 parenting questions predict very powerfully how people see the world politically across a very wide range of issues. So it has turned out to have tremendous predictive power in helping to explain people's political perspectives.
Fascinating. Okay, Sarah, let me bring you into it here. How would you characterize the appeal of the authoritarian leader?
I think that's a question that really varies in different contexts in different countries. We're talking about it from the American perspective where, about 25% of the country chose Trump, who has authoritarian tendencies. I think they chose him for a variety of reasons, not necessarily having to do with personality. And then you also see authoritarianism as a system, as a form of governance. And how that is expressed really varies whether you're talking about a deeply ingrained authoritarian system like Uzbekistan, newly right-wing or severe, systems of government like we've seen in Turkey, or to a lesser degree in Poland or in Hungary, or the kind of system we have here, which I would characterize as a government with autocratic or authoritarian leanings, working in a society that is not actually authoritarian, or I wouldn't be here talking to you. We still have, some of the baseline principles of democracy. They're threatened from above. There's an ongoing back and forth as to what direction we're going to be headed. But I think that this is more of a systemic issue than it is a question of personality or disposition. And
Lou can follow up on that, if you would, insofar as the psychological appeal of authoritarianism here in North America versus overseas, for example, in Europe or Asia. How similar, how different?
Well, I think it's very similar here in the United States and in Western Europe, in the sense that I think as Jonathan's work has shown, that the people who tend to be more authoritarian than people who support, tend to have an authoritarian personality in ways that people who don't support them. But I think that in places like Russia and established authoritarian regimes, the nature of support is very different. That here, in those cases, there's a tremendous cost to supporting opposition. So work by Jonathan's colleagues has actually shown that people who support Putin in Russia tend to be the most agreeable and conflict avoidant, because they just want everybody to get along, and the best way to get along is just to support the autocrat. And that's almost the opposite of what you find in support for autocratic populists in the West. These are people who are not agreeable at all, right? And so it's a very different population. So you have to be really cognizant of, whether you're talking about an established authoritarian regime or a democracy.
Well, yeah, follow up on that if you would, Mariam, because, a lot of people are trying to make the argument that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are essentially different sides of the same coin. Are they?
Well, I come at this from the perspective of the Global South. And in the Global South, very often, I think the appeal of authoritarianism is the ability of many authoritarian regimes to bring about rapid economic growth. So the question becomes whether people are going to go for a slow and steady democracy, or if they're going to go for a rapid and volatile authoritarian regime. And very often, that's the kind of question that's grappled with in the Global South. So countries like China, countries in the past, at least Pakistan, authoritarian leaderships have been appealing because these regimes have promised high economic growth rates. And in fact, that's when these countries have actually experienced economic growth, right? So
under authoritarian
regimes. So economists very often come up with the argument that authoritarian regimes are far more efficient, maybe, in their decision-making, in their policy-making, than perhaps democratic ones, which is why we saw the most rapid economic growth in the developmental states of Taiwan and Korea when they were dictatorships.
Well, the fact is they can decide more quickly than democracies,
absolutely,
can't they?
Absolutely.
Is that an advantage, therefore?
That's the argument that is very often made by rational choice or economic arguments, that these are regimes that don't actually have to take into account public opinion. Right, because of which they can make unilateral decisions and very often have longer-term horizons because they're not restricted by term limits or constrained by term limits.
Lucan, I presume it's an advantage until growth rates stop growing at 10% and recessions come on, and then you're in trouble.
I think that's definitely true, although I would add that the evidence about regime type and growth and economic reform is a little bit uncertain. There's not a very strong correlation between authoritarianism and economic reform and economic growth. But certainly, I think regimes like China and Putin in Russia, they depend heavily on consistent economic growth. And if that goes down, then the regime is definitely in trouble.
Sarah, Stalin, of course, had communism, and Hitler had his version of fascism. Dictators seem to have ideologies. But let's go fast forward here. Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, in America and France, respectively. Do you see a specific or a coherent ideology that seems to drive their support?
Yes, there are connections between them, but I would say the main ideology of Trump is basically Trumpism, is kleptocracy, is an impulse to take the United States of America, strip it down for parts, and use that money to personally benefit himself. I think that that's his primary goal above any kind of overriding ideological objective. However, he is linked and is actively taking part in a growing white nationalist movement that you see throughout the United States, and you also see throughout Europe, and certainly in figures like Le Pen. You mentioned the definition of populism before. I think this is a good time to kind of specify that populism is often used as a euphemism for right-wing white nationalism, which is what they do when they're trying to kind of give it a pretext of economic discontent or nostalgia or looking back to the good old days. These movements are connected. They're certainly connected to Russia and to Brexit and to all sorts of international actors who are trying to propel these governments in a specific kind of direction. And, that's an alarming situation for the West.
Lucan.
Yeah, so one thing I just want to add that the rise of populism in places like Hungary, the United States, and Venezuela, which we haven't talked about, has been preceded by an important levels of polarization. Polarization means that political conflict is no longer about small changes in tax rate or that opposition is seen as an existential threat to your survival. And if opposition, which is often created by cultural changes like rise of minorities, and if opposition is seen as an existential threat to your survival, well then of course you're going to resort to autocratic means to prevent the opposition from gaining power. And it's interesting because polarization, there haven't been that many established democracies that have collapsed, but all of them, Chile in the 70s, Uruguay in the 70s, Venezuela, Hungary, have all the fall of democracy has always been preceded by intense polarization of politics. And I think that's in a sense, the most dangerous phenomenon that we see right now.
Let me get Jonathan to speak to something that Sarah just sort of introduced. And Sarah, I know you weren't saying this, but I want to be clear on this. There are people today who want to equate authoritarianism with populism. Jonathan, they are or are not the same thing?
I guess I'll answer yes and no. I think they've often been conflated. One is often used as a synonym for the other nowadays. I think historically, populist movements have very much focused on a redistribution of wealth in ways that I think authoritarian-minded folks, for example, are not all that interested in. I mean, they are interested in making sure that they benefit from whatever economic goodies should be available. But it's not an ideology that argues for a fairer society more broadly. It's an ideology that argues that certain people should get theirs, especially people who sort of look like them. So to the extent that populism, at least in some contexts, is not always wedded to ethno-nationalism, I would say that is one distinction between the two ways of thinking about the world.
Mariam, you prepared to make a distinction between the two?
Absolutely. I don't think authoritarianism and populism ought to be conflated. I think, if you're looking at authoritarianism as a system of governance and as a regime type, it's not the same thing as suggesting that at the same time a populist leader is also in place. So I do think that they need to be distinguished from one another. And I agree with a lot of the points that Jonathan just made.
Sarah, we don't have, Belarus or Kazakhstan-style authoritarianism in the West yet, but we are starting to see seeds of something. And I wonder if you could help us understand from your perch in the Midwest of the United States, why you think we are starting to see the seeds of that.
Well, I think, over the last decade, we've had a lot of traumatic changes in the United States. We've had 2 wars. We've had a massive recession from which most of the country did not recover, especially where I am in the Midwest. And our institutions have been weakened, which provided an opening for somebody like Donald Trump, who wants to exploit that pain, who wants to exploit whatever, kind of genuine populism there is to get back to that in terms of people feeling like they're not represented, people feeling like they're not getting their share, and move in, and basically hijack the mechanisms of government in order to benefit himself. And so, I think a lot of things collided with this election. It was, kind of a perfect storm of a certain kind of candidate, a typical, authoritarian leader who's very charismatic, who understands the media system, who understands how to manipulate people, who understands financial corruption, who's been engaged with it for 40 years, preying on a very vulnerable population. And so now we're at the point, where our system of checks and balances is being tested, where people are realizing that they can't take their rights for granted. They're realizing what those rights are as they lose them. I think, we're certainly not anywhere near, the kind of authoritarianism you see in a place like Kazakhstan, which is actually comparatively mild for Central Asia. But we're certainly headed in that direction. And most alarmingly, we have a government that seems intent on bringing us in that direction, despite the fact that the majority of the country did not vote for it, did not endorse it, and even those who voted for Trump often voted for him, based on false promises that he made.
I want to play back those words to you, Lucan. We are headed in that direction, says Sarah. Do you agree?
I think that's a real danger. And I think the problem is not just Trump. We get a lot of attention because he's Trump. But I think the problem is also that the Republican Party is essentially an authoritarian party. And what do I mean by this? I mean that they treat opposition as illegitimate, which is basically the essence of authoritarianism.
You don't think the Democrats do that too?
No,
really?
They do not treat opposition. They're about compromise. The Republican Party, since Newt Gingrich in 1994, has basically shown an unwillingness to compromise and treated politics as a zero-sum game. They impeached Clinton in 1998. They refused to allow Obama to appoint his own Supreme Court justice. I mean, this is a politics of zero-sum game, which is deeply tied to authoritarianism. So I think the problem is, I agree, is actually much bigger than Trump. So in a sense, if Trump loses power, we'll still have the other major party in the United States be essentially an authoritarian party.
Mudding, do you see a rise of authoritarianism in the West?
I do. I mean, I think coupled with not just what we've seen in Trump, and I agree with Lucan that yes, the Republican Party has this very, very authoritarian way of functioning, and the fact that it limits bipartisan cooperation on many, many issues that are important for American governance, I think is very critical and needs to be mentioned and talked about. Speaking to the rest of the West, not just the United States, absolutely. I think we've gotten a bit of a perfect storm going on right now, which is economic anxiety, along with an aging population, along with a refugee crisis that Europe has borne the brunt of with the Syrian refugees coming in, has just created a situation where there is a lot of anti-immigration and a sentiment and a lot of Islamophobia, which I think combined are all things that a candidate like Marine Le Pen has manipulated and used to her advantage. So, just the way Sarah mentioned, Trump is a master at manipulating the media and a master at, definitely familiar with financial corruption. I mean, Marine Le Pen in the same way. I mean, this has been her rhetoric right from the get-go. And some of the moves she's made since the first round of the election in France, such as stepping down as the party leader, but continuing to be the face of the party and continuing to be the voice of what the party stands for, even though she's tried to distance herself from that rhetoric, I think is very telling.
We are seeing some polling already from the first 100 days in Donald Trump's administration. And while the overall polling numbers are, I think, the worst out of any president since polling began in the first 100 days, there's another number that we can't lose sight of, and that is 98% of those who voted for Trump are sticking with him and are happy with the way things are going right now. If there is an encroaching authoritarianism, Sarah, maybe I'll go to you on this. If there is an encroaching authoritarianism in the United States right now, his base seems to be A-OK with it. Isn't that right?
I think we need to make a distinction between people who voted for Trump and people who we could describe as his base or his fans. During the course of the campaign, I interviewed a lot of people, and I also live in a red state. I live in a state where, most people voted for Trump, so I would just interact with them casually and discuss it. A lot of people I spoke with were not enthusiastic about the prospect of a President Trump. They hated Hillary Clinton. They were holding their nose and voting for him, or they were pro-life, or they had always voted GOP. And there is is this kind of, cultural identity aspect to it where they're just absolutely under no circumstances going to vote for a Democrat. Those Trump voters, some of whom I've spoken to since, actually are not particularly happy with him. The things they're upset about is that lack of stability, is the chaos that this administration has caused, and the lack of predictability in their lives, which is one of the reasons that, they wanted him to begin with. They, saw him as more of a strongman figure who'd come in and fix the problem. And one of the most interesting conversations I had was during the airport protests when I was talking to someone who'd voted for Trump, and he said, he was very upset. He's like, I really hate these protests. These protesters are so annoying. They need to stop. Trump needs to change his policies. And I was just startled because this is a guy who, say, during the Ferguson protest, just absolutely was anti-protest all the way and blaming it on the protesters. And here he saw it as Trump being incompetent and needing to, take charge and act like a president. So I'm not sure I buy the polls in the sense of they approve of him. I think that it's quite possible they just simply don't want the Democrats to gain power. And so if they're asked by a pollster, do you want him, do you not want him, they will go with wanting him because they also fear that alternative.
Jonathan, what inference do you draw from the fact that the president seems 98% strong to have maintained the base that elected him back on the 8th of November?
Yeah, so I agree with Sarah. I think, both in the U.S. presidential elections in 2016 and in Brexit earlier last year, and in other elections in which right-wing authoritarians have done very well, these have all been razor-thin margins. And I think when that happens, there's probably a tendency to overcredit whichever side that it is won. Trump lost the popular vote by 3 million. His current approval ratings are sitting at about 40%. In fact, right now, Trump is not sitting on a winning coalition. So I think while it's true that many of his supporters are sticking with him, and I agree with Sarah, to some degree that's just probably defensiveness. None of us really like to admit that we're wrong. So I think that's probably accounting for part of that number. But I think what's really interesting is the degree to which Trump appears not to be trying at all to reach beyond his base, which is consistent with what we know of his personality. And I think despite the trauma of having watched that guy get elected and take office and do what he's done, it seems to me that actually he's in a very weak position right now, regardless of whether some strong core of his supporters are still behind him.
Lucan.
Yeah, no, I guess I'm a bit more pessimistic in one sense. In the sense
you always are when you're on this program.
Thank you very much.
You always
are.
That's my
role. In the sense that there's a reason, you mentioned, the fact that, many of those people are dissatisfied with Trump. But the truth of the matter is the polarization in American politics means that they will possibly never go over to the other side. And it's precisely the fact that so many small d Democrats in the Republican Party who really held their noses at Trump were still, disliked him, but could never imagine voting for a Democratic centrist. I mean, that's disturbing. At the same time, I agree with Jonathan in the sense that I think it's important to realize that while there's been a rise in populism, almost with the exception of Venezuela and Hungary, they've never achieved a majority support. I mean, and that's important to realize that they may be reaching a ceiling, hopefully, and it's not clear that Le Pen could ever get a majority. It's not clear that Trump could ever get a majority. So I think that's important to keep in mind. So that's a bit of optimism. There you go.
A bit of rare optimism from you.
Thank you.
Let's talk. I want to read this from Jonah Norberg from The Spectator from a few months back, talking about the disconnect in the world today between the way things are and the way many people see them. Here we go, Sheldon. Let's put this up. If you think that there's never been a better time to be alive, that humanity has never been safer, healthier, more prosperous, or less unequal, then you're in the minority. But that is what the evidence incontrovertibly shows. Poverty, malnutrition, illiteracy, child labor, infant mortality, they're falling faster than at any other time in human history. The risk of being caught up in a war, subjected to a dictatorship, or of dying in a natural disaster is smaller than ever. The golden age is now. And yet, Sarah, so many people in this world think that's not the way it is, which presumably helped elect Donald Trump. Explain.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's nonsense. As we've discussed in this segment, with Syria alone, you have a crisis that has taken on international repercussions in terms of refugees. We've seen rising authoritarianism throughout the West and beyond it. And in terms of the economy, I think that that's one of the biggest, misconceptions, and it did help Trump get elected. Often the Obama administration and the press would float these very low unemployment statistics. They would say something like, we're at 5% unemployment, and Trump would come in and he would say a lie. He would say actually unemployment is about 40%, which obviously isn't true. But I have to tell you, coming from St. Louis, a place where the economy has been in bad shape for a long time, that lie felt true. And it felt true because of different measures, things like underemployment, things like the lack of wage growth, and just a general sort of expectation of your prospects of life, how you're going to pay your bills, how you're going to get by, what kind of opportunities come your way. That does emotionally affect people. So I think this idea that we're in some golden age and everything is, rosy and wonderful is just absolutely diluted. We've had progress on many fronts, but in terms of how people experience it, and certainly in terms of these massive crises, like white nationalist authoritarian movements or the Syria conflict, I actually think we're at one of the worst points in the last 100 years. So yeah, I don't know where that guy's getting his info from.
Well, James Kirchick, who is on the program tonight as well, who has got a book out called The End of Europe, says we are on the cusp of witnessing the end of Europe as we have known it for the past 7 decades. He's probably as pessimistic as you on most things on this, but Mariam, you tell us, are you there, that pessimistic as well?
I'm not that pessimistic. I wouldn't go so far to say that it's the end of Europe, but I am concerned about a lot of things that are going on in Europe, absolutely. I mean, I think the Brexit vote was very telling of the rising tide of nationalism, if not authoritarianism, in Europe. But apart from that, I am concerned about Europe being able to sustain its economy. A lot of the younger people in Europe are not happy. Yeah. They're not happy because their economies are not progressing the way they ought to. They're not progressive economies. In fact, I would say they're quite inflexible in the way that they're set up. They're very regulated, heavily regulated by the state, and there's not much innovation going on in Europe, the kind that would actually excite the younger generation. And that is why I think Europe really does have to deal with an aging demographic. Has to deal with an aging demographic, which is, frankly speaking, more nationalist than maybe some of the younger folk. And we saw some of that age/class divide with the Brexit vote,
surely,
for example.
Yes. I mean, the only thing I would add to that pessimism, as is my want, because what's striking about the European project is it's now opposed by both the extreme left and the extreme right. So in a sense, you have this moderate middle, which is being squeezed both from Le Pen on the right and from Mélenchon on the left. And similarly in Europe, in Great Britain, where the Labour Party was very uncertain about its support for the EU. So I think the project is in great trouble.
We've got about a minute left here. Jonathan, let me give it to you, essentially to ask the question, there's this great quote, the center cannot hold. The center may be holding actually in France. The center seemed to hold in the Netherlands a few weeks ago in their election. What's your view on whether or not this genie can be put back in the bottle?
So I think what concerns me, I probably lean toward the optimistic end of the spectrum, that I don't think these currents are majority currents in these countries. But what's disturbing is that they have become mainstream. Le Penism was a fringe phenomenon 35 years ago. Something like Trumpism would have been a fringe phenomenon in the United States 25 years ago. And the fact that they are now, even if we're saying they're at 40%, that makes them real players in these political systems in ways that I think is that's just a very unnerving new reality that we're all dealing with.
To be continued. I want to thank all of you for joining us here on TVO tonight. Jonathan Weiler in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Sarah Kendzior, whom you can read in the Globe and Mail, from St. Louis, Missouri. Here in our studio, Luke and Wei from the U of T, Mariam Mufti from the University of Waterloo. Great to have all of you on the agenda this evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.